I have the honor today to have as guests Dr. Iain McGilchrist and Thomas Campbell, two scientists from different fields who have generously agreed to join in our discussions on the research and understanding of those fundamental things important to humanity: the nature of ourselves as human beings, the nature of reality, and our place in it. I say fundamental because they may have different metaphors and concepts and may not necessarily agree with each other on all things, but that's good. The discussions are really what matters. Iain wrote The Master and His Emissary, now considered an important classic, and his latest book, The Matter with Things, was written over the span of 10 years. He meticulously set out this two-volume work in the hopes of having the words flow easily for the readers. Tom wrote his big theory of everything over 5 years with the same goals, keeping serious subjects light with humor and asides to reach both the general audience and the scientists. This generosity and passion to reach their readers with their combined decades of significant research reflects in the way they chose to write their books, thoughtfully and carefully laying out the words, not sparing the length. Both Iain and Tom suggest taking their books at a slow pace, a little at a time. I'm still learning about your work, Dr. McGilchrist. I am slightly more familiar with Tom's work, but you have to revisit the work and slowly let it sink into the being level by experiencing it. The key points of both Iain's work and Tom Campbell's work, consciousness, experiencing, intuition, and imagination, drew my attention, and these points will certainly prove to make an interesting discussion today. I have a quote from Iain: "We do need to deal with physics and consciousness together." That's a good start. For the most part, we will be speaking about Iain's newest book, The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World. Dr. Iain McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, neuroscience researcher, philosopher, and literary scholar. He is a Quondam Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, an Associate Fellow of Green Templeton College, Oxford, a Fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and former consultant psychiatrist and clinical director at the Bethlem Royal and Maudsley Hospital, London. He has been a research fellow in neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins Hospital, Baltimore, and a fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies in Stellenbosch. He has published original articles and research papers in a wide range of publications on topics in literature, philosophy, medicine, and psychiatry. He is the author of a number of books, but is best known for The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain, and the Making of the Western World. In November 2021, his two-volume work, The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World, was published by Perspectiva Press. Tom Campbell, a lifelong professional applied physicist, served the technical intelligence community and worked as a consultant for NASA within the Ares 1 program, where he created large systems simulations to assess problems of risk and vulnerability to ensure mission success and crew survivability. He began a parallel career in the early 1970s researching altered states of consciousness with Robert Monroe, a consciousness pioneer, at Monroe Laboratories in the early 1970s, where he and others were instrumental in getting Monroe's Laboratory for the Study of Consciousness up and running. Campbell continued his research into the nature of consciousness and reality, and in February of 2003 published My Big Toe Trilogy, which represents the results and conclusions of over 30 years of personal scientific exploration into the nature of existence. This overarching model of reality, mind, and consciousness explains the paranormal as well as the normal, unifies physics, philosophy, and metaphysics, generates a more general and comprehensive science of the objective world, along with a new understanding of the subjective world, places spirituality within a scientific context, solves a host of scientific paradoxes, and provides direction for those wishing to create peace, happiness, and satisfaction in their lives within an expanded awareness of a larger reality. In the fall of 2016, Tom presented a set of quantum physics experiments designed to provide evidence for or against the hypothesis that our reality is information-based and that consciousness constitutes both fundamental source and processor of that information. In the spring of 2017, these experiments were published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, International Journal of Quantum Foundations, under the title On Testing the Simulation Theory. Currently, these experiments are being performed at the California Polytechnic University and at another major university outside the U.S., and the paper is available to view at the Caltech website. If I may, I would like to have each of you give a short summary of your big picture view of the nature of reality, the way things are as you see them from your unique perspectives. Iain, let's start with you.
Okay. Yes, I ought to be able to give an elevator pitch on this. I've been asked so many times. I begin from exploring something that people believe is nonsense and pop psychology, which is the difference between the two brain hemispheres. What is nonsense and pop psychology is most of the things people think they know about this topic before they read my work. But after reading it, they should have a much better understanding of the fact that these two parts of the brain, which underlie to a very great extent our consciousness, however that consciousness is related to the brain, see the world in different ways. And these conflicts between the different ways of seeing the world emerge in philosophy, in some of the paradoxes encountered in it, possibly also in physics, incidentally, so I'm told by physicists. But in any case, is my starting point, because if there are two different versions of the world, which are not exactly compatible, but we draw on both of them, which of these are we more entitled to believe if we're seeking after the truth about who we are, what the world is like, and so on? So that is the, if you like, the neurological foundation. I then, in the new book, that's part one, in which I look at the various facets of our ability to understand the world, the various portals through which we can get information about the world. And I describe these as attention, perception, judgment, apprehension, emotional and social intelligence, cognitive intelligence, and creativity. These are all the faculties that we bring to bear in order to have anything at all to work on to understand the world. Then at another stage, we have paths towards truth. And I take these to be fairly uncontroversially science and reason, and perhaps slightly more controversially, but that's to do with some aberrations of the way we now think, intuition and imagination. And I suggest that, in fact, we need all four of these, and if possible, to bring as many as are relevant and apposite to bear on any question, but that in each case, the better part of what is given, including in science and mathematics, is given by the right hemisphere's ability to understand a whole picture. See, the right hemisphere sees a world which is flowing, interconnected, never entirely certain, never entirely static, in which context matters enormously, in which much of what is going on has to remain implicit, that when you drag it out of its implicit nature, where it's embedded in experience, including emotional and embodied experience, you change its nature. It's like explaining a joke, it falls to the ground. So it has a picture of something which is alive, embodied, contextual, flowing, changing, interconnected, and importantly, present although I'd qualify that by using the word that Heidegger uses, presencing, that it, in other words, comes into being for us through our consciousness. It's not just passively present, but it's something that we have a two-way relationship with and which comes about through our commerce with it. The left hemisphere, on the other hand, sees a world which is entirely represented. In other words, it's presented again after the fact when it's no longer present. And that world is like a map, a theory, or a diagram in relation to the world that is mapped. And in the same way that a map contains very little information about the real world, only a very tiny fraction of 1%, that doesn't make it unimportant, because in fact a map is useful simply because it excludes very much information. The mistake is only when you mistake the map for the world. And the picture that the left hemisphere brings about is one in which everything is isolated, static, fragmentary, decontextualized, abstracted, categorized, and no longer has any uniqueness or any vitality. And this representation of the world, I argue at some length in the second part of The Master and His Emissary, is the one that for the last 300 years we have increasingly espoused in the modern West, and has led to great mistakes in philosophy and in our understanding of who we are and what the world is, and following on from that, the errors we've committed in destroying the natural world, fragmenting society, and turning our backs on anything beyond the purely material. I think these are all essential to human flourishing, and we seem to have left them behind. So in the third part of that book, I then go on to look at the nature of reality. I believe it is primarily relational, that things, hence the title, The Matter with Things, is a kind of pun. There's a problem about thinking that things are foundational. Things emerge from a network of relationships. You can't actually have the thing until you see what it's created, what has been created by the relationships in which it stands. So that's part of it. I believe that that it contains an element that is called a coincidentia oppositorum. In other words, that opposites tend to coincide rather than be at opposite ends of a pole. That if you pursue something far enough, you will find yourself meeting its opposite very quickly. This is an ancient perception that, again, we've lost. I believe that the world is resonant and vibrant and takes part in consciousness. In fact, that consciousness is an ontological primitive, that it underlies everything, and that matter is in fact a phase of consciousness which offers a degree of permanence and a degree of resistance. And I then go on to look at the nature. I can't go into it now, obviously, because I'm just doing a very brief scan of the overall terrain, but I look at the nature of time, which I think is fundamental, space, matter, consciousness, values, purpose, and the sense of the sacred. Those last three people might be surprised about as being important constituents of whatever is, but I do believe that they are, and argue at some length for that position. So there we are. In the end, what I hope to have done is take people from what I consider an intellectually bankrupt, morally bankrupt, and spiritually bankrupt vision, which we've been fed assiduously for the last half a century or more, which is that of reductive materialism. Well, it really goes back more like 150 years, which physics has managed to shake off in the last 100 years, but biology generally hasn't until very, very recently. There are good signs that it has. I want to take people away from that vision and suggest that the world is never fully knowable, but is far richer, more complex, more beautiful, more resonant, and more animate than the one that we are supposed to believe.
Thank you so much for that beautiful summary. Tom, please go ahead.
Well, let me start my summary by saying I agree with all of those things that Iain just said. His results and conclusions run very parallel to my results and conclusions. We just come at it from entirely different viewpoints, and that always makes for interesting conversation. I think there's things to be learned when you get people from entirely different viewpoints agreeing with what the conclusions and results are. There's a lot to be learned there from the different perspectives, because reality and reality models and so on are mostly a matter of perspective. It's the way you look at the world and the way you interpret what that world means. That's the difference. Well, my attitude and understanding of reality kind of came over the last 50 years or so. We had two kind of seminal events, and I listened to Iain talk with Rupert Sheldrake, and in this conversation, they both said that they had a time in their life where they could just pursue their own interests. They were free to develop in any way they wanted to. They got out of the structure of academia that is, you look at these things in this way, and you go down this path and come to these conclusions, and they could think for themselves for a time, and were encouraged to do so. And that made all the difference in the world with who they became, was that time they had to be basically free thinkers on their own to pursue their own interests. Well, I had also something in my background that caused me to go down the path that led me to where I am, which is very different than the path I would have taken otherwise. And that is that as a graduate student, I went to become indoctrinated into the TM, Transcendental Meditation, because they put up a sign on the physics door, in the door of the physics building that said, if you do this, you can get by with less sleep. And I'm a graduate student, and I run this big accelerator thing to do my research, and when that thing's running, you use it, because it stops running every now and then. It's a very complex piece of machinery, and to keep it running is a skill all in its own. And if it's going to run for 3 days in a row, then you stay up for 3 days in a row and do your research, because when it breaks, it may be broken for another month or two, and you have to get back in line to get on it again. So I wanted to be able to stay awake and stay alert, so I went to TM. And at that point, I was the same kind of boneheaded physicist that most physicists are, and that is that if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. They call that an operational definition of reality. If you can't perform an operation on it, which usually reduces to measure it, poke it, see it, connect to it, somehow interact with it, then it either doesn't exist, or if it does, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. And that's the way most physicists view reality. And I was kind of like that too, because I'm a physicist. So I was up through all the channels, and I didn't get a chance to think on my own, or like Iain and Rupert did. But shortly into that experience, and I found that experience, I took to it very, very well, very easily. Meditation was a simple thing for me, and I got it instantly. And I found out that I could debug the software I was writing in my mind. I could bring up a scroll of the printout, and I could go down through it, and all the lines that had errors or problems with it, they'd be colored red. And I just stopped the scroll and back up a little bit, look at it, and I knew them all because I created all those lines of code. I wrote every one of them, so I could look at it and know exactly what it was. And then I would go check it. I'd go up to the lab, pull out my 4 or 5 boxes of cards. Yes, cards in those days with little holes punched in them. Yep. Very hard to debug things in those days. There was no debugging software. Your job either ran or it didn't run, and the only information you got about it when it didn't run was, well, it bombed. That was it. So debugging was a little more critical in those days, because you also had to get in line to run your job, and that may take a week itself. So you spend a lot of time debugging that people don't do anymore. A machine does a lot of that for you. But anyway, indeed, those lines that were red were lines with problems. And sometimes the problem was very subtle, like the card punch hole was just a little out of line. There wasn't anything wrong about the statement, but the punch hole was a little out of line. So when I couldn't find anything wrong with it, I just repunched the card. Oh, that error wasn't an error anymore, you see. So that just crashed my whole viewpoint of reality. If you can't measure it, it isn't real or it doesn't matter. Because now here was something that violated all of that. I couldn't measure it. I didn't have a clue what was going on or how that worked, but I knew that it worked and I knew that it was correct. And I was getting information through some not normal way. And that information was fantastically useful, correct, and very specific, very precise, specific stuff. It wasn't feel good or vibrate with the cosmos or anything general like that. It was, this statement has an error in it. So that's information you can check and see whether it's good or not. So that led me to another whole, idea about reality. And here I am, a physicist, and what we physicists do is we model reality. That's our job. And now there was this whole other big piece of reality that I didn't even know about. I'm modeling this little chunk over here, and I find out there's another piece of it that is totally outside of my knowledge until then. So at that time, I kept my meditation going and took it even more seriously, played with it. So what else can I do with this tool? Where else will it take me? What else can I find out? And the event that happened to me that really changed the course of my life most dramatically was about 6 months later. I happened to run into Bob Monroe, and Bob Monroe was the guy who wrote the books Journeys Out of the Body, Far Journeys, and Ultimate Journey. And he was this businessman, wealthy businessman, and he had these out-of-body experiences. And basically his book was just a diary of his experiences. He didn't make any claims. He didn't say what they meant. He just said, here's what I experienced, and here's the information I got. So Bob was at the time just putting together a lab to study consciousness because he wanted to make science out of this, because he didn't want to be the crazy old guy that, had funny experiences. He had talked to a psychiatrist, Charlie Tart, and decided that he was sane, because his first thing was, am I going crazy? Am I losing it? Is all this stuff, hallucinations? And he and Charlie decided that no, he was perfectly sane. So then he started playing with it. Well, when I met Bob, he had this building, and that building was to be a lab to study consciousness. That's all he had. It was build it and they will come, Well, I came, I was there, a friend of mine, an electrical engineer, we were there. And it's like, we were very skeptical, because that's the way physicists are. And it was like, well, if this turns out to be a lot of mumbo jumbo, we're out of here, But if it isn't, wow, what an opportunity. We're going to learn from the guy who seems to know how to experience this other reality that I was now aware of because of my own meditation. So I worked with Bob for, like a second job, like 20 hours a week, 15 to 20 hours a week for like 5, 6, 7 years. And that's a lot of hours. And Bob taught me how to not only go out of body, but how to reproduce altered states of consciousness very precisely, so that I could do physics there, because I'm still a physicist and I want to understand how does it work. So I could do an experiment there, experiments that had evidence, just like the debugging the software. And most of these centered around paranormal things like remote viewing and healing and the things that you could do that affect the real world. And then you could see whether or not you were, actually had the effect or didn't have the effect. Now, remote viewing is very direct, and you either get it right or you don't. Healing, you have to do a whole lot of it because it's more statistical. Yes, you may have worked on somebody and they got better, but they may have gotten better anyway. That just may be the way it was. So now you have to do it, and you have to do it in extreme cases, like somebody is given 3 hours to live and the priest is already there holding their hand, and suddenly it turns around and a day later they walk out of the hospital. So that's rather dramatic. That if you have a chain of things like that, that's more evidential than, yes, they had a headache and then they got better. Well, they may have gotten better anyhow, So
of course,
I did these things for those years, and got to the point through all of my experiences that I no longer said, is this real? I knew that, and that was a big step that I got to. So I spent the next 35 years saying, okay, I understand this about consciousness. I think I understand consciousness pretty well. So I understand, this is a fact of consciousness and this is a fact, and consciousness is like this and it's like that, and it's not like this other thing. And consciousness sometimes is squirrely. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't seem to work. And why is that? What's the difference between when it works and it doesn't work? So I spend about 35 years trying to answer all those questions. And I eventually end up, and I do it by research. I change a variable, try it again. Does that make it better or worse? Change the variable, try it again. And you have to repeat. You can't just change a variable and do it once. You change a variable and do it, 20, 30 times. So it just takes a lot of time. It's very tedious work. But eventually, I felt I had a good grasp of consciousness and what it was and what you could do with it and how it worked and why it worked that way. So I wrote my books mainly as a theory of consciousness. And my general philosophy, I guess, would fall under a thing called idealism, which goes back to Plato's cave. There's what we see is not really what's important or what's there. That's just the shadow on the wall of the cave. There's something else behind it all. And to me, that something else was consciousness. So I wrote the books, as kind of a description of consciousness and why and how of consciousness. But I also realized that if consciousness is fundamental, like I thought, that was one of my facts of consciousness. Consciousness is fundamental. It's the source. And if you go there, then the rest all has to be derived from consciousness. And that puts you in a position of having to derive physics from consciousness, because physics is part of the rest. So how does that happen? And that's where most idealists run up against the wall. They can't derive physics from consciousness. But if consciousness is the superset, then physics ought to be able to show that it comes from that. And then about 2 years after my books had been published, I had some aha moments where all that fell into place. And I was able to derive first quantum physics from consciousness. And I could say, why should particles be probability distributions, or best described as probability distributions? Why not only is that possible, but why is that necessary? Couldn't be any other way. Has to be like that. Logic says that's the way it will be. Could have predicted it before anybody ever came to that thought. I could have predicted that. And then I said, well, gee, if I got that, then how about the other big mystery in modern science? And that, of course, is the heart of relativity, which is, why is the speed of light a constant? Why does, everything else in the world, velocities add? But with this one thing, they don't. Doesn't matter what the velocity of the source is. If that source creates light, that light just goes the same speed. It's constant. And then I find out that, well, it's not really constant. It's sort of constant, but every once in a while, it changes a little bit in the 10th decimal place. And I thought, well, why is that? And I had a perfect logical answer for both of those. I know exactly why it's constant, and I know exactly why it changes a little bit, but only in the 10th decimal place. So all of those things made sense. And I started looking for all the other things that are in science or in biology or anywhere that are called paradoxes, things we know are true, but we don't know why they're true. And I looked at, the thing, what did they call it? The anthropic principle, that we have these 4 or 5 fundamental constants. And if any one of those, that describe the universe, and if any one of those constants changed even in the 9th or 10th decimal place, the universe would have been unstable and still wouldn't even been here. It'd all crash. So it looks like these constants were all, worked together. They were all somehow tuned to each other just to make a universe that was stable. And I can explain that just logically, exactly how that came about and why it couldn't have come about any other way. That has to be that way. And I know how they were tuned and why they were tuned. So all of these paradoxes fall out just logically. And the more paradoxes I tried to dig up, the more I was convinced that, hey, this model actually does derive science. And I learned of a new paradox when I was listening to Iain and Rupert, and that is the snowflake paradox. They mentioned that in that talk, and sure enough, that's one I can also explain very logically. So all these paradoxes, and when I say explain them, I don't mean with some grandiose explanation that has 6 new assumptions in it. I mean, just explain it simply and elegantly from the theory that derives consciousness. Nothing extra added. And the theory of consciousness itself only has 2 assumptions under it. One is consciousness exists, and the other is that evolution exists. That's it. Other than that, it's just deductively logical. So that's kind of where I come from. So I have this theory of everything, and as it turns out, that not only allows me to create a better, more general theory of the objective world, physics, but it also allows a theory of the subjective world.
Very
And
important.
now
Yes.
there's a science of the subjective world. So in my model, I can tell you why people are struggling and why they're unhappy and why, those kinds of things. It comes out, what is the purpose of life? Why are we here? Is there a purpose, and what is it? And how do we serve that purpose? And all of that comes out not as philosophy, but as science, as logical. It's a logical derivative of the model of consciousness. So I have that, and that is so far out of the box. And let me explain that in a way. Is that all right? We've had now 1 century since the double slit experiment in quantum mechanics was founded in around the early 1920s. So now we are in the 2020s, and a century later. And what happened is that in the initial founding of quantum mechanics, if you read the writings of the guys that were involved, Niels Bohr, Wigner, Planck, Heisenberg, Schrodinger, they all are so excited. They're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and they're so excited about, wow, we've got a whole new view of reality here. Materialism is basically dead because materialism won't allow single particles to go one at a time through slits and arrange themselves in an interference pattern for just because they want to. Material viewpoint doesn't allow that to happen, but it does. So they were so excited about a whole new set of ideas and science and principles, but they couldn't come up with a theory. They couldn't come up with an explanation of why it ought to be that way or why it had to be that way. So for the first couple of decades, everybody was trying really hard to come up with some kind of theory to back up that paradox, and they failed. Einstein worked at that. He worked on a toe for the whole last half of his academic career, and he failed. They couldn't come up with something. And we have quotes like, yes, I know consciousness is fundamental and has some part to do with it, but I have no idea how to translate that into equations and translate that into theory. So they were kind of stuck there. Now, what that told the rest of the physicists for the next few decades was that there is some new perspective, that if we just had a different perspective about the nature of reality, all this would make sense. And what is that perspective? Well, another 50 years go by, and there's still no progress. So what that tells you is that indeed there is a new perspective that makes all of it falls into place, and it all makes perfect sense. But that perspective is so far out of the belief box that science has trapped itself in that it's too outrageous. It couldn't possibly be true. You can't even think about it. So it's like they've backed themselves into a corner that doesn't have the answer in it.
Okay, for my benefit and for the benefit of listeners, can you do a really, really compressed answer to the? If you said you've got the answers, you haven't told us anything about what they are.
Yes, I do. I can tell you about that. Just finish that one point. So if that perspective wasn't really, really strange, if that perspective wasn't really crazy sounding, then it couldn't possibly be true, because we've had a century of some of the best minds. Physicists tend to be bright people. We've had some of the best minds trying to come up with something, and they come up with nothing, because here's the box they live in, which has to do with their cultural beliefs, and this perspective is too far outside that box to be viewed from inside the box. And
Okay.
any case, so now what is it? So we'll get down to what is it? Well, I told you it's basically idealism. Okay, that's the root of it. But idealism with the idea that consciousness is fundamental. I mentioned that. Now, I look at consciousness, and I define consciousness very simply as awareness with a choice. That's it. Now, the choice means, of course, if you don't have choice, the other alternative is determinism. There are no choices. So if you have a choice, it's a free will choice, or it's not a choice at all. So we have, and awareness is described by information. What is it that you're aware of? Awareness is awareness of self, awareness of other, inside and outside awareness, if you will. And that self and other can be described with information. Outside is like this, and you describe it. Inside is like this, and you describe it. So awareness can be modeled as information, an information processor, if you will. So I look at consciousness as an information system. It's about communication. It's about understanding. It's about information. Now, what is information? Information has to be separated from data. Information is understanding. It's the significance, the meaning. That's the information. Data is just stuff that we can transfer. Data is squiggles of ink on a page, holes in a card. That's data.
Sure.
And now it takes a consciousness to look at that data and find meaning and significance in it. So information only exists within a consciousness. Data can exist outside of consciousness, and we can move data from person to person, but you can't move information from person to person. You can only take the information, turn it into data, send them the data. They take the data and they have to translate that. They have to take that and turn it into information. You see, that's how it works. So we have this information system that is fundamental, and it evolves. And what my model does, my model is kind of an analog to Darwin's model. And Darwin's model is also fundamental. Darwin's model explains a whole lot of paradoxes, like why does Flipper, everybody's favorite dolphin, have finger bones like this, in his flipper, and Darwin's explanation, not necessarily Darwin, but what Darwin's explanation has become, in modern science, explains all of that. So mine is the same way. Darwin took a cell, and then he let that cell evolve into everything that we have, through evolution. I take a simplest piece of consciousness possible. You could call it a consciousness cell. And that is something that is just aware that it could be in state A or state B. That's it. It's just aware. It's aware of itself, and it's aware that it could be in this state or that state. Now, that is the simplest piece of consciousness that I can model. It's it's awareness, but the awareness is very, very limited. But you can take this state or that state as a 1 or a 0. And if you can have a 1 or a 0, then you can have a 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. You can change that state. So now...
That sounds awfully like data rather than information to me.
Right. So it creates data. Exactly. It creates data. But that data then can be given... You can symbolize things. When it's a 1, 0, 1, 0, well, that means that can stand for. So it becomes the stuff upon which understanding is built. You create symbols, you create language, you create things with meaning, you create metaphors. So that's where that comes from. So now I see this big information system called consciousness, and it evolves. And how does consciousness evolve? It evolves by lowering its entropy, because that's how every information system evolves. Start with an information system where all the bits, and a bit's just defined as the smallest piece of information. That's one of those ones for that 0, and where all the bits are random. There is no information. If it takes those bits and orders them in some way, then it lowers the entropy, because entropy is a measure of disorder. So they order the
Sure.
bits, the entropy is lower, and now that ordered bit can have meaning, can have significance, can be attributed to
No,
that
I
piece of
get all
data.
that, Tom. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So then we have this system, and it evolves,
Yeah.
because it's trying to lower its entropy, which means more order, more more symbols, more things it understands. And the more that it can create order that has meaning and has significance, then the entropy keeps getting lower. So it continues to evolve. And I can show then logically where that evolution leads, the consequences it has, and where it has to go next, and the stages it goes through. So that's the way that model then takes you through the evolution of consciousness and gets to the point that says, well, then where do we come from? How do humans in this reality, and where's that come from? And that falls out of that just logically. It had to happen the way it happened, and it couldn't be any other way. And when you're done with it, you end up with an explanation that'll answer all of those paradoxes logically and straightforwardly, with no extra assumptions or anything behind them. So that's basically where that goes. It's that model,
Yeah.
and it follows the same way Darwin did. You know, he can describe the complex, like the bones in the flipper, and all sorts of things like that would be paradoxes, but they make sense once you look at it from a Darwinian viewpoint. And that's the way it is with this. If you look at it from the point of the evolution of consciousness, all of those things fall together and make just. And the thing is that once you see that, Ian, and it's hard to see because it's a giant step in what paradigm. It's a huge step in the paradigm. But once you get that, everything that you've experienced starts to become so simple. Everything that is complicated, everything that's very mysterious and all wadded up into whatever, it all just falls out and simplifies to be very, very simple. So it turns out to be an extremely elegant and extremely simple model of reality. Now, let me say, I don't believe one word of it. It's just a model of reality. You see? It's just a model of reality, and models are valuable based on how well they can answer the mail, how well they can predict, and how well they can explain. That's all. And when a model isn't perfect. A model changes as people come up with new ideas, and it comes up with new things that it can't explain. Then the model has to change or go away. So this is just a model of reality. It's not something that I believe in. I'm totally open to it changing or whatever. I'm just trying to fit the data. So that's where I'm coming from.
Okay. Yes, I can see there's just obviously an enormous number of points that we could talk about, or I could have a slightly different viewpoint on, perhaps, which would be interesting. I think it's great when, as you say, people from different points of view arrive at similar conclusions, because it suggests that probably there may be something in it.
Yes.
So I like that. I'm slightly worried about the depending on quite how hard and fast the distinction is between the inner and the outer. And one thought I had is that, I think a central thing that we may disagree on, to go to something that might be controversial, is depending on what you mean by idealism. I'm not a straightforward idealist. In this, I find I'm not entirely at one with Bernardo Kastrup or Donald Hoffman, who I think runs the risk of modeling things as though they were a reality, when actually they have only the structure of a model. Bertrand Russell said that we know a certain amount about our conscious experience, but we know nothing about reality, because reality, all we know about it is the mathematical structure of it.
Mm-hmm.
But a different point of view would be that of, I mean, a consonant one, but nonetheless one that lays some significance elsewhere is Whitehead's position. And if I'm a follower of any philosopher of the last 100 years, it's probably of Iain Whitehead, who said that it's not good enough for science to reject the business of experience, the redness of the sunset that we experience, just describe it in terms of interference and caused by dust particles and whatever else. That is one way of seeing it. But the whole business of experience, because as you say, it's not measurable and it can't be taken into the lab and simply pinned down. It doesn't mean it's not important. And what I worry about is, you see, perhaps I could just say something about where I think the hemisphere hypothesis is relevant here. The left hemisphere, as I said, deals only with an internal model, and it imagines that everything that is real is in its mind. So what is real for it is what it has invented, and what it has invented is its model. Whereas I think the right hemisphere accepts that there is some reality to experience. It's obviously not the whole picture, but whatever I'm experiencing is not simply inside a hermetically sealed unit. It's not experienced by a homunculus inside the brain that can't see outside. I think our experience of reality is partial, but not because we can only go part of the way towards reality and then we hit a wall, but because it's only partial, because it's just my experience and yours is just your experience. But they're very real experiences. So that's a difference, I think. And what it restores is a relationship between what I call my consciousness and whatever else exists in a broader consciousness. It also restores what I call a reverberative or resonant relationship in which each party is affecting the other. Whereas if you're actually inside something and all you see is data projected on a screen, which I believe is Donald Hoffman's point of view, then you're back in the left hemisphere's idea. It's just exactly how the left hemisphere would imagine reality to be, that all you can see is a readout. I object to this both on logical grounds and on, if you like, more psychological grounds, that simply experience carries a kind of reality for me. All the important things I know come through experience, but also that if you deny all reality to experience, you cut the floor from under science. We can't do science anymore because science is based on something empirical, and that means what we observe, what we know from a something. Now, if you say that our understanding of it is completely unreal and it doesn't bear any relation to reality, we can't do science. In fact, we can't reason either. All I can say is, well, you know what you know, I know what I know, and we've really reduced the world to a state of isolated monads, Leibniz's monads, in which we're inside something but we can't break out of it. And I see this as going back to a pre-Kantian universe in which, ultimately we can't know anything. Now, I would like to resist that bit of what you might be saying, but you can tell me, you can finesse what you've said and say, I didn't mean to intend whatever it is Donald Hoffman seems to intend.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree with everything you've said. I've been right with you, and I'm going, thumbs up. That's right. That's right. That's right. All of it.
Oh, okay,
and
good.
I have the same problem with Donald Huffman and with Bernardo. I've talked to both of those, done videos with them, and
yes,
it's like they've got one foot outside the box, but they can't pull the other foot out. It's one foot stuck in the box, and they just have to keep going back to that reductionist mentality where you take all the little pieces and you build up the whole out of it. And that's not the way the whole's made. It's not made out of little pieces. It goes
No.
the other way. You have a hole, and out of this hole,
Yes.
you can see it. You can get information that describes it as little pieces. But yeah, I would agree with
Yes.
everything that you said.
Okay.
I have.
Yeah.
That's why I like you,
So,
Ian. That's why when I looked at your book, I said, well, here's a guy who has a deeper understanding of the nature of reality. Because absolutely. So when I talked to Bernardo, there was just some to where he's
mm,
up here and he's explaining all stuff and he's rational and it all seems to make
mm,
sense. And then he devolves over into this other thing that is not rational at all. It's a story that he's
mhm.
put together because it feels right to him and it feels
I
good.
think
And
it's a story entirely out of mathematics,
yeah,
and this I want to warn him again in the words of Bertrand Russell that what we know is so little because all we know is the mathematical
yeah.
structure of
Well,
something that we have
yeah.
conceived.
Well, I will
Yeah,
say,
actually, Niels Bohr said the same thing. The trouble with physicists is they mistake their model for the reality.
exactly. That is the problem with physicists.
Yeah.
But in the beginning, they often realize that their mathematical model is just math, and then they make up metaphors to try to interpret what the math means in terms of physical terms. And in the
That's
beginning,
surely all right, isn't
I
it?
believe they understand that those are just metaphors, but the metaphor becomes a fact,
Yes,
and that's a problem.
but I query the word just metaphor because I think metaphors are profound, and actually the only way we can understand anything is through a metaphor. All science, all
Yeah,
knowledge, in fact, is in a way metaphorical.
it
It
is.
says it's something like something else, and I see, yes, it's that forging of a connection, carrying one
Yes.
across a cognitive gap, which metaphor does.
Yeah.
And Niels Bohr himself said, and I believe he's right, and I don't think he was the only physicist who did, that the language of physics has to become like the language of poetry, because it's only through metaphors that we
Yeah.
can actually explain what it is we're seeing.
I agree with that. Absolutely. And my model is all a string of metaphors. They're all
Yep,
metaphors. I talk about the larger consciousness
that's
system. That's a
fine.
metaphor. That's a metaphor. I talk about all the pieces. Everything in there is a metaphor. My idea about the math is that if you understand something fundamentally, if you get to the fundamentals of it, you don't need much math. Math
Mm,
is useful when you look at the logical derivatives from that fundamental understanding. You go down that logical rabbit hole to see, what are the logical implications of this in this particular situation. Now it gets mathy as you do that. But fundamental understanding doesn't require math. Matter of fact, math gets in the
no.
way. Now, I would say Darwin's theory of evolution, that evolution of the plants and the animals here took place progressively through, step by step, depending on the strain and the stress between the organisms and their environment and the need to
Mm,
procreate and the need to survive. And all of that then
mm,
worked out. So that is fundamental. Darwin doesn't have a
yes.
lot of math in his theory. It's not
Mm,
dependent on a lot of complex math, but yet it's elegant and it explains things because it's
mm,
fundamental. Now, I'm sure you can
yeah.
take parts of that biology and go down a rabbit hole and end up with a lot of
Mm.
math, looking at chromosomes and what they do and
Well,
the probabilities and so on. And you can probably make
yeah.
some math there, but the basic
Well,
understanding is kind of beyond math. It is in the
yes,
form
I
of
think that's
metaphors and poetry and discussion, and it's
yeah,
basic understanding. So
that's
physics
right.
is
But
like that too.
because I'm talking in enormous simplifications, and I don't have time to finesse what I'm saying. I don't want people to run away with the idea that somehow I think maths is anything other than real, beautiful, and useful. It's just that it is not the whole story by a million
Hmm.
miles. It is
Yes,
an aspect of
it is.
reality. Now, that is the important point because nowadays everybody wants it to be this is the thing, or that is the thing, or it
Right.
must be like this. But what I'm saying is it's complex. There are many, many facets to reality, and we need to use a number of different faculties that we have. Our mathematical reason is part, but there's another kind of reason, which is the wise judgment based on the whole of one's experience. There is also science, which can answer some questions, and it can answer them beautifully and helpfully, but it can't be tasked with answering ultimate questions. It simply isn't capable of doing that. It has certain axioms it works on, it unpacks what it can using empirical data, and that's great. Yeah. So I'm a great champion of science and reason in an era in which I see fashionable philosophers kind of kicking the ground from under them, and I don't want to do anything to aid that. But I would also say that paradoxically, it falls to somebody who wants to defend science and reason to say they're best defended by not overstretching them and maintaining that they can do everything. They can't do everything. And this is where we come to intuition and imagination, which have a particularly difficult time at the moment, because there's a whole industry of psychologists going around making a lot of money, going to businesses and trying to tell people that they shouldn't trust their intuitions because science has shown that the intuition is fallible. What science shows is a completely different story, and I unpack that over 3 chapters in The Matter with Things. That intuition is extremely important, and imagination underlies our ability to grasp, if we can put it that way, to comprehend, to embrace anything at all in science, in reason, in intuition. Imagination is the faculty which it's not the same as fantasy, which takes us away from reality. It's what gives us the only chance of actually making contact with reality. We need that faculty.
Yeah, absolutely.
Underlies everything.
Absolutely, I agree with that completely. You know, the way I see science is that science must be logical, must be reasonable, must be rational, but that doesn't mean it must be mathematical. Logic and reasoning don't have to be mathematical. Mathematics to me is just mathematics is the logic of quantity. That's my definition of mathematics. It's the logic of quantity. Now we look around in the outside world, and everything out there can be described in terms of quantity. You know, it's this wavelength, this weight, this size, this shape, this quantity, you know. So the logic of quantity is just very useful when you're dealing with the quantities of things. And we see that mathematics can describe the world in terms of quantity. So that's all math is. It's the logic of quantity. But as you say, big ideas and understanding aren't about quantity. They're about something else entirely.
Okay, so I find myself having to step in and defend maths a bit, because it does deal with quantities, of course, and that is a limitation, but it also does deal with shapes and relationships. Ultimately, that is the most important part of both maths and physics. I mean, interestingly, Niels Bohr's notebooks don't contain a single equation. They only contain pictures. And he thought in terms of shapes and relationships. I think this is how all great scientists think. And I'm sure that it's true of Darwin too. He was what you might call a natural historian. He wasn't primarily interested in the maths. He was interested in actually observing the living things. But he was also a very thoughtful man, and he noticed certain things and then elaborated them. And at that point, statistics will have to come into it. But, you know, I think, like you, that I think we're agreeing here. I just didn't want anyone to go thinking that I disrespect mathematics, because I actually love mathematics. I think that the Euler equation is one of the most beautiful facts about the cosmos.
Yes, I'm not throwing mathematics under the bus. It does wonderful things.
No,
quantity is very important to us, but you're not going to find mathematics describing the quality that of my relationship with my wife. You know, that's just not mathematical. That is. You're not going to, because that's not about quantity.
I hope it isn't.
No, that's about quality. It's about other things.
It's all about quality.
Yeah. So the point is that quantity isn't the whole picture, like you say. It's an important part of the picture, and it's an elegant and a very informative part. And shoot, we're sitting here using technology that was all based on mathematics and science and physics and reductionism, and that gives us all this wonderful stuff that we have. Along with, because those people also had had insights and they had, aha moments and stuff
Yes,
that weren't that way. But
absolutely.
anyway, the two have to work together. It's not like they're opposed to each
Exactly.
other. It's all part of the way the world is. And we just
Ex-
err when we say the math is the whole thing. And if you don't
Oh,
have mathematics, then that's not science. And that left brain, that logic, that process, that's the whole thing. And that other right brain, well, that's just woo woo and probably doesn't even exist. There is no such thing as intuition,
yeah,
and
yeah.
anybody's imagination is just useless stuff they're making up. And all of that is unbalanced.
Mm,
So we need to find
yes,
the balance. You
yes,
have to have both. And they both have to
yes,
work together in order to produce something that is of value to all of us. So
yes.
that's where,
Y-
yeah, that's where
y- y-
that's the way I go.
No,
And I think you
yeah.
are
I
in the
mean,
same boat.
that's lovely. I mean, I'd just say again for the benefit of listeners that, and I don't quite see the hemispheres in this way. The right doing reason alone, and the left doing,
No,
intuition
I
alone.
don't either. Not
No,
reason
but
alone.
it's more subtle than that. But anyway,
Yes, it
but
is.
yes, I know what you were referring to, and one of the battles I'm fighting is against the natural assumption that we can simplify things by taking things that look to the casual eye as though they somehow are opposed to one another, and we have to choose between them. But in fact, it's holding the tension between these two very important aspects of reality, whatever they may be, that appear to us paradoxical, that means that we're on the path to truth. If we ditch one in order to feel comfortable,
Hmm.
because most people feel uncomfortable with paradox, we've then lost our hold on whatever it is that may be true.
Hmm.
And the temptation when you're faced with a paradox is to say, well, one of these must be right and the other one
Hmm.
must be wrong. And
Yeah.
what I would say, though, is I have a whole chapter on logical paradox. And what I suggest is that it arises from the different stance, the different disposition, the different, what you've called perspective on the world
Hmm.
that each has, that it will approach what it sees in a certain way. And this will lead to certain conclusions. And all I would say is that when I think I look at over 30 well-known central logical paradoxes, I think I can show that in pretty much every case, the problem is that the right hemisphere seems to see something that is very important and would lead us to being able to describe what we actually see. And the left hemisphere is getting stuck in its map, in its formula, in its schema of how things should be. And that is how we come to. So in that case, I do say that one of these is more veridical than the other.
Hmm.
And again, this doesn't mean that you can dismiss one. These are when you talk about two different things, and most people who I speak to want me to say this is good and that is bad. But I want to say, no, it depends on the circumstances. This is helpful here, this is helpful there. But that doesn't also mean that they're both entirely equal. One may be more valuable than the other, but it still needs the other. You
Hmm.
know, in a
Absolutely.
useful, in a laboratory, you cannot function without a cleaner, but you cannot function without a physicist. And although that may offend against the democratic spirit of the age, the physicists, the physicist's project is going to be more dependent on the physicist, but it's also dependent on the cleaner.
Sure.
I mean, everybody in a
Mhm.
team plays a role. Not everybody is the leader of the team. This is okay.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
we tend to grow up and evolve our understanding, particularly because of the culture we're in, I guess, is that we tend to work on one or the other. We work on that
Yeah.
intellectual side and we read, and that's what we do when we start school, right? That school teaches us to do that.
Yes.
And mostly we leave the right side, the side, the intuitive part of it. We kind of let that kind of lie fallow and don't do a whole lot with it. So we tend to be in our culture very unbalanced. We're very much left brain, and the right brain is mostly misunderstood. Oh,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
information we get's very unreliable. But
Yeah.
in my experience, you need to be very right brained and very left brained both at the same time, and you need to integrate them because each one
Yeah.
does what it does in the realm in which it works, it does it magnificently, and it's very valuable.
No.
And the two of them don't compete or fight with each other. Once you develop them both, they work together as a team. This gets a little bit of that intuition that it needs, and this takes a little bit of that analysis that it needs, and it all melds together, and that gives you your optimum interaction. But I have found,
Of
if I just
course,
had to differentiate them, I'd say that the right brain can be more reliable and more accurate than the logical left brain, because it's got more information available to it. And then I bring in the left brain
yes.
to do analysis, to sort and dice and look at things in different ways and do that kind of thing. But basically, my truth, my basic stuff all comes out of the right side, because that has more information and more connection and more looking across broad things and getting,
Yes, as you may know, yes, I've provided the scientific underpinning for what you are saying, that and demonstrated that the right hemisphere is simply much more reliable witness to reality than the left hemisphere, and that the left hemisphere on its own is literally deluded. I'm not the only person who said this in the field of neurology and neuroscience. So it is very important that we maintain the two together. I just again want to gloss, you said the left rational. The left can also be highly irrational. Both it is
most of the time.
It's true. No, because one of the things I have to do is I have to keep dispelling the kind of bad old myths that were said about the two hemispheres, and emphasize that what I'm saying is something new and different. They both take part in reason. They both have emotions, and at the end of the day, the kind of rationalizing of the left hemisphere can be profoundly irrational and deluded, and it can also be prey to emotions. One emotion that lateralizes most strongly of all is anger, and it lateralizes to the left hemisphere. So it's not that calm, dispassionate, reliable, slightly boring accountant. It's a deluded. It's a deluded power seeker that is resentful about its position as secondary, as the emissary. I know I'm personifying, but you either got to understand this in terms of people or in terms of machines, and it makes more sense in terms of people, which is, after all, what we're describing, a part of a person. Not actually a machine. The brain is not a machine.
I agree with that, and I find it unendingly amusing that our Western culture, who tend to live, out of our left brain, we tend to dominate. The left brain dominates. We very much are into the piece part world, and how it all fits together. And the thing that is amusing is that we believe that we are so very rational, that we are so very logical, and people walk around feeling, particularly the ones that I call, my metaphor, they live out of their heads. Everything comes out of their left brain, thinking about the piece parts, that they have this sense of being completely logical and rational, when the fact is just the opposite. There are very few things that people do, very few choices that they make are made through logic. Mostly what makes their choices is their fear. That's what makes most of their choices for them, and that's entirely irrational.
Yes, and as G.K. Chesterton commented, a madman is not somebody who's lost his reason. He's somebody who's lost everything but his reason. and this was a point that was confirmed by a very distinguished psychiatrist and philosopher, Iain McGilchrist, who said exactly the same, effectively, that he didn't know Chesterton's saying, that the thing in schizophrenia is there is a kind of unhinged reasoning goes on, and all the rest, one's ability to understand, common sense, intuition, emotion, is somehow lost, and all one has to guide one is something like a computer program, well, it's more complicated than that, but
Yeah.
it's something in that realm. So it's worth just making that point.
Iain, if I may make a point,
Yes,
and
sure.
somewhat to what you have been speaking about, you became a
Hmm.
doctor, a psychiatrist from the
Hmm.
desire to know what happens when things that go on in people's minds actually cause physical changes and illnesses. What happens
Yes.
in the brain completely changes their world. How has your research addressed this? And then Tom can maybe comment on that from his point of view as well.
Yes, I think the experience for anybody who works in the world of mental illness is one of awe, really, before what one sees, which is things that are changing in somebody's experienced world as a result of something, as it were, having changed in their brain. And it can change very rapidly. It's not just with illnesses like schizophrenia. After an injury or a stroke, a bleed in the brain, the person's world can, at least initially, become, I say initially because it can later compensate, but initially it can be completely deranged. And it's no good trying to argue with that person about what it is they're experiencing, because for them, that is the reality. And this business of the way in which our conscious world and our physical selves are, in my view, aspects of one and the same thing is really important. I'm not suggesting that the mind is wholly dependent on the physical instantiation in the brain, but for most of one's life, this is what is happening. Consciousness is tied to this particular brain. But there's also effects that consciousness has on the brain, and it can also heal the brain to enable it to function in relation to the requirements of consciousness. So it's a very good point that was made by a late 19th century British philosopher, Schiller, not the German playwright, that and it's worth thinking about that when a part of the brain is damaged, other parts of the brain seem to be aware that they need to recruit a different piece of tissue that can now do that task. Now, if you think about a machine is unable to go, but something's not right with the way I'm working. I need to recruit some part of the mechanics here to do a completely different job. So, I mean, it's just one of the 1,001 ways in which the brain is not like a machine. But what I'm really saying is that the mind and consciousness are not the same as the brain, but for most of our life here, they're closely tied to one another. And I believe that ultimately they are aspects of the same underlying entity, which is consciousness. So I believe the fundamental thing that exists is consciousness, and that what we call matter are things that, including the brain, things are disclosed to us by our consciousness. We know, for example, that matter exists only because we have consciousness. We don't know that consciousness exists only because we're material. That might be the case, or it might not. But it's certain that we only have experience of matter because of consciousness. And matter is an aspect, I believe, of consciousness whereby for a while, whatever it is that consciousness is able to bring forth is given a degree of permanence. It's slowed down, if you like. It's given inertia so that it can't completely flow away immediately. And it provides a degree of resistance. And I can't argue for this now, but I'm just going to state it, that I believe and argue in the book that resistance is important to every kind of creativity, that resistance is how anything can come into being, and matter fulfills that humble but very important role, if you like, within consciousness. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that specifically, Tom.
Well, I do. I have a lot of, I tend to agree with it basically, but here my theory would be probably get further away, from your theory. Not that we disagree,
Okay.
but it's just that
Okay.
it's different.
But that's okay.
And
Yeah.
that is that I see, as I said, consciousness is fundamental, and consciousness is an information system. And I see that the physical body is, and the physical world, the physical universe, is just informational. There is no matter. Remember the little boy in the movie where there is no spoon? That is the way it is. I think that there is no physical matter. There is just consciousness. And this consciousness, because it needs to evolve, which is more structure, and it does that by interaction. You have pieces of consciousness can interact with each other with free will. I skipped a couple of steps, but they interact with each other with free will, and they evolve and can evolve based on their choices that they make. And those choices are very limited in what you have in just communicating. It's like a big chat room, and your choices are all very limited, passing information back and forth. So in order to have more interesting and more choices with more significance to them, one has to create another context. The first context was just communication protocols so that everybody could communicate. So that's like the first reality. You have a rule set that defines communication protocols. All right, that lets consciousness evolve up to a certain point, but it's difficult to go much further. So then consciousness has to create a new context that has much tighter rules. A game is defined by its rules. If I say, okay, Ian, let's play a game. Okay, go ahead, go first. You won't know what to do because there's no rules. The rules define the game, it defines the strategy, it defines the complexity. And if the rules are just very simple, then you have very simple things that you can do. If the rules are very complex, then you have a much broader, deeper range of things you can do. So it needed a context with more rules. So the larger consciousness system, which is just consciousness, of which we're a piece of that. Yes, we are all one because we're all a piece of that larger consciousness system. We're subsets of it. We're kind of stuck there. So the system created another context, and we just call that a virtual reality, a context in which there were rules, a game in which you could play. So it creates this reality not by programming it, but by creating a set of initial conditions and a rule set, hitting the run button, and let those initial conditions change, according to the rule set. Now, in our universe, we've talked about the initial conditions being a tight ball of plasma in a small space, and that the rule set is what we call science and physics primarily. And then that ball of plasma expands according to the rules, and eventually it cools, and you get suns and planets, and here we are with this universe. It evolves that way. In my mind, that all happened in a computer within consciousness, because consciousness, being an information system, can configure itself as you and I. It also can configure itself as a computer. It can work
How
with
did the rules come into being?
Trial and error.
Sorry.
Trial and error. So at first it came up with some rules, and it said, all right, run. And it ran for about 3 seconds, and boom, it didn't work. So it says, all right, let's go back and let's I got to make gravity a little not so strong, because it all just came right back together.
Yes,
so I turned gravity down. All right, take 2. Oh, I need to adjust this. That's why we end up with those 5 constants that are all tuned to each other.
So rules have evolved, exactly.
The rules evolve. The system evolves, and then eventually that simulation, that virtual reality, evolves. It's our universe, right? And it evolves creatures like us. Now, how does that help consciousness? Well, an individuated piece of that consciousness is like you and me. An individuated piece of consciousness can basically log on and make all the choices of that entity, of that human being. So then I would say that our bodies are virtual, in a virtual reality, in a virtual universe, and our consciousness is the player. Now, an interesting thing about virtual realities is that if you, from the perspective of the avatar, right?
Yep.
So I'm playing World of
Yeah.
Warcraft, and I have an elf playing World of Warcraft. From the perspective of that elf, the player is what makes all the choices. Well, the elf doesn't think that. The
Yeah.
elf thinks it
Yeah.
makes choices, but the player's job is to make all the choices. From the elf's perspective, the player is non-physical, and the computer that computes it is non-physical, because the computer that computes it can't be a piece of what it's computed. You see, it has to be outside of the virtual reality. So that leaves us then as physical bodies are computed, and nothing more is computed except what is seen. Just like the newer virtual reality games, they do it. It's done the same way, and that means that the computer consciousness is non-physical to us, and the player, our individuated unit of consciousness, is non-physical to us, but it makes all the choices. So now it makes the choices, and by making those choices, it evolves. It lowers its entropy or increases its entropy based on the choices. Also, when you have, here's another little interesting, I'm kind of running through this in the high spots, but another thing comes out of this is if you have a social system, which this then is, it becomes a social system, the optimal way to lower entropy, which is the goal of the larger conscious system, is to lower entropy. It's how it evolves. The optimum way is that the pieces cooperate with each other, coordinate, cooperate, care about each other. That in a social system optimizes what that social system can create, the entropy that gets reduced. So what that tells us is that the ultimate goal here is to lower the entropy of our conscious, and that means cooperation, caring. I just call that the love side. We're supposed to grow from our choices to become more caring and more cooperative and more about other and not so much just about self. And that's the purpose, because that lowers entropy within the system and facilitates the evolution of the consciousness system, of what it can build out of all of its piece parts. So that is one, so that's one thing that gets it. Also defines good and bad, evil and good, because what's good is what lowers entropy, and what is not good is what raises entropy. So we have that then falls out. But now let's say we talk about the placebo effect. How is it that mind and matter, how do they interact? Well, the avatar can places constraints on what the consciousness can do with that avatar. The consciousness can't say, okay, Tom, jump 10 feet in the air, because the rule set from which Tom's avatar evolved says can't do that. So the consciousness sets constraint. I mean, the avatar sets constraints on the consciousness, but generally the consciousness leads and the body follows. So if I'm a real angry kind of person, I'm depressed, I'm full of negativity, then eventually my brain stops making so much serotonin. And then pretty soon, I have to go take Prozac or something to boost the serotonin. But it's not that the serotonin, just for some accident of biochemistry, happens to be lacking. It's that my attitude, my negativity, created that situation. So the mind leads, the body follows in many ways, though the body sets constraints on what the consciousness can do with that. So there's lots of them. There's lots of things I could say, but I think I've overloaded you already. But
it's okay. There's an awful lot I can say too, but I don't think we've got time. So I think what we have to agree is that there's much here that we do agree on. I think there's quite a lot that you said just in the last bit that I probably want to qualify in a number of ways and investigate with you, but that's probably all that we've got space for right now. So there we are.
I agree.
Yeah.
Well, this is good news, because this means another interview with you. I hope that can happen. I know you had somewhere you had stated a structure of love, and I just wanted to mention that is Tom's of his big theory of everything, with all of the physics and all of the points of it. Love is the answer, is his conclusion, his ultimate conclusion. So But
That's
going,
a wonderful
yeah, it's
conclusion.
that is his whole
Okay.
main conclusion. Very quickly, you both propose a big picture of reality and of us. The state of the world is concern for many. Each of you, just a short statement on what are the solutions that you think would
Oh, heck.
help us in a better world.
Well, we've got to be very, very, very quick and brief, and I don't know
Yes.
how to do that. But
Okay.
uh, uh, I think it's not so much things that we need to do, although there are many things that we do need to do, and many of them are very well known, to do with, for example, halting the destruction of the natural world, helping to heal societal breakdown, and so forth. But I think it's also about two things that are not the way in which the Western mind normally thinks, about stopping doing things, maybe every bit as important as doing things. That, speaking as a psychiatrist, the way to help somebody is often to get them to identify what they're doing wrong and stop it, because otherwise there is no space in which whatever good can come about. So we need to stop certain things as much as to do new things. And above all, we need to inhabit a different disposition towards the world, a different way of being in the world, is how I would put it. And Tom would use perhaps the expression a different perspective, but that's fine. But unless we do that, things we do will not make any difference. And a simple analogy I make is if somebody goes to a Buddhist monk and says, "How do I become a Buddhist?" He doesn't say, "Well, you cut meat out of your diet and you sit on the floor for half an hour every morning with your legs crossed." It's not going to do any good. It's about a whole new way of thinking about who you are, who other people are, what the world is, how they all relate. So that's all I've got room to say.
That's beautiful,
Yeah.
Ian. Very beautiful.
Yeah.
Tom,
Well,
how would you?
I will try to be concise as well. And yes, Ian, you're exactly right. I agree with that. I'd say that, as we look around in the world and we see all the things that are wrong, we see the greed, we see the basic ethic is control, power, force. That's the coin of the realm.
Exactly.
That's what gets you ahead is control, power, force. And that is a symptom of the problem. That's a
Exactly.
symptom of the problem. It's not the problem, it's a symptom. And you can fix a symptom. You can get rid of this dictator and get somebody else in there who's kinder and gentler, and it'll all go back eventually in just exactly the way it is, the way it was, because we are still who we are. We haven't changed. So we have to, and now in my terminology, of course, we have to increase the quality of our consciousness, which means lower the entropy, caring,
Yeah.
about other, not about self. And that's the problem. Our average quality of consciousness is just low. So
Yeah.
control, power, force is the way we approach things rather than caring, helping, whatever. So that changes. And if we change that, then all of these things we see that are wrong will just fix themselves all by themselves. We don't have to go fix any of it. It'll all change because now we will have changed the source. And how do we do that? Well, you can't change anyone else. You can only change yourself. So your maximum contribution you can make is grow yourself up to the point that you don't have so much fear, that you make good choices based on love and caring and being helpful. And if you do that, that will help others do that as well. And it's not a matter of what we do. It's not a matter of acting. It's not a matter of acting more kind. It's a matter of being kind. There's a big
I think
difference between acting and
this is
being. And
this
if
is
you,
exactly what I'm saying, and I think
yeah,
we completely agree
yeah,
on that.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
so far, Ian,
And
everything that you said, I completely agree with. We haven't found
yeah,
any problems yet.
and as an aside, the desire for power above all is the value that leads the left hemisphere, and that desire for connection and what you would call love, and I think I probably agree with you, is is something that will come from the right hemisphere more than from the left.
Absolutely.
So there we are.
Thank you. Thank you both
Well, look,
so
it's been
much.
amazing, and I'm aware that because we've talked rather longer than I intended, that there were no lights on in this room, and it's getting dark.
Quite all right.
So I'm gradually fading out and becoming more spectral.
This has been amazing. Thank you so much, and I hope we
Thank
can
you,
have
Tom.
another conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you, Iain.
Thank you. It's been lovely talking.
It has been, and just as I thought, you get people who are skeptical and open-minded, and you have wonderful conversations.
Yes.
And I look forward to further conversations. I would be delighted to spend time with you explaining every one of your questions, and I think I can give you answers to all of your questions that you will find very reasonable and rational. So I'd like to give that to you as a challenge, to see if that works out. I would enjoy that, because I feel that there's things here that I can learn. I can learn from you. When you share perspectives, there's learning within the synthesis of those perspectives. And that's why I seek that out. So hopefully this won't be a one-off. This will be just the beginning of a getting to know each other and each other's ideas and the reasons that we've got those ideas, and a sharing. And I look forward to that, because I think I'll learn a lot.
That's great. When one stops learning, one stops living. And
yeah.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Donna.
Thank you, Donna.